It was a gray morning in Duncan, Oklahoma, the kind of day when the world feels quietly complicit. Inside the small, nondescript county courthouse, two women stood signing a marriage license, side by side. One was 43. The other, 25. They held hands, they smiled, they took photos. There was no music, no guests, no questions. On paper, it looked like any other same-sex marriage in post-legalization America. But the names told another story: Patricia Ann Spann and Misty Velvet Dawn Spann. Mother and daughter. Bound not just by blood, but by something darker, something unspoken. The clerk who filed the documents would later claim she didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to know. This was no ordinary union. This was a ceremony born not of love, but of control. A relationship long severed by the state had been resurrected, now twisted into a secret pact. Behind every vow was a breach. Behind every smile, a scream no one heard. Most families carry stories they don't share. The Spann family carried one so unnatural, so grotesque, it would leave a nation stunned when it finally surfaced. And yet the most disturbing part wasn't that it happened. It was how easily it was allowed. How the system failed not once, but again and again, until it became almost impossible to say who was victim and who was predator. This is the story of a mother who married her own daughter, and the forgotten American machinery that let it happen. Patricia Ann Spann did not come from love. She came from fracture, generations of it. Her early years unfolded in silence and instability, buried under layers of small-town neglect and familial dysfunction. The public records say little, but the gaps say more. Children don't just disappear from their mothers without cause, and Patricia's 3 children were all taken from her by the state. Officially, it was for neglect. But unofficially, the story is more complex, more human, and infinitely more terrifying. She was barely a woman when she became a mother. The world around her offered no real structure, no lessons in care, no road map for compassion. What she knew, she repeated. What she lacked, she substituted with control. And when the state intervened, when Oklahoma's Department of Human Services severed her connection to her children, Patricia's role as mother didn't end. It mutated. Over time, the bonds of maternal instinct atrophied into something else: obsession, possession, identity. She began to see motherhood not as a responsibility, but as a tether. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. Her children were no longer people to raise, but people to retrieve. The more the state tried to protect them from her, the more convinced she became that they still belonged to her. Years passed. Her children grew up in foster care, scattered and reprogrammed by the system. But Patricia waited. She watched. She kept track. And when the legal restrictions lifted, when her daughter Misty turned 18, she reappeared not as a parent offering reconciliation, but as a woman with a plan. She was charismatic in the way deeply broken people often are. She knew how to make you feel like the only person in the room. She told Misty what every wounded child wants to hear: that she had been wanted, that she had been missed, that no one else in the world could understand her pain. Patricia framed herself not as a mother returning, but as a soulmate rediscovered. But beneath the tenderness was a predator's precision. Patricia didn't just want a relationship. She wanted control reasserted, boundaries erased, and roles rewritten. She wasn't just reclaiming a daughter. She was laying the foundation for something far more disturbing. The story of Patricia Spann isn't about a mother who lost her children. It's about a woman who refused to let them go, and the devastation that followed when the state let her back in. Misty Velvet Dawn Spann was a child of shadows. Her name sounded poetic, almost imagined, but her childhood was anything but. Taken from Patricia's custody before she could form lasting memories, Misty spent her formative years in foster care, bounced, evaluated, monitored, and largely forgotten. She grew up chasing stability in people who were paid to care. And somewhere along the way, she learned not to ask too many questions. Children like Misty learn that silence is survival. By the time she turned 18, Misty was no longer a child, but she wasn't whole either. She was fractured, tentative, eager to belong to someone, anyone. So when Patricia re-entered her life, it didn't feel like danger. It felt like closure. At first, Patricia presented herself as the mother Misty had been denied, a woman full of apologies and soft explanations. She spoke of regret, of the lies the system had told, of how she had fought to find her daughter. She painted the state as the villain and herself as a mother wronged by bureaucracy and betrayal. Misty, unarmed with the tools to question such a narrative, accepted it. She wanted to believe it. And in Patricia's gaze, she saw something she had never known: attention, consistency, a version of love. But the love was not maternal. It began with long conversations, then cohabitation, then a private language, touches, gifts. Patricia told her things that blurred lines, that love was rare, that the world wouldn't understand what they had, that sometimes society's rules were made to be broken. Misty, isolated and emotionally dependent, followed her deeper into the psychological maze. By the time Patricia proposed marriage, it wasn't phrased as a question. It was an inevitability. Misty signed the papers not because she understood, but because she trusted. She believed because belief was safer than doubt. The woman who should have protected her had made herself indispensable, a gatekeeper of love and identity. This wasn't romance. It was grooming, slow, deliberate, and meticulously cloaked in the language of family. Misty's consent was never real. It was sculpted from absence, carved by years of longing, and sealed by a mother who never truly returned to parent, but to possess. The wedding was the culmination of a manipulation so complete, Misty didn't even realize she was being consumed until it was too late. The license was filed on March 25, 2016, in Comanche County, Oklahoma. There it was in black ink: Patricia Ann Spann and Misty Velvet Dawn Spann, applicant and applicant, mother and daughter, now wives. The clerk processed the paperwork without hesitation. Legally, it passed inspection. No flags, no alerts, no alarms. Misty's birth certificate, curiously, didn't list Patricia as her mother. That omission, intentional or bureaucratic, would become Patricia's shield. "It's not illegal," she reportedly told a friend. "There's nothing that says we can't." They were married in secret. No press, no fanfare, just two women and the silence of a courthouse too accustomed to processing trauma without question. A judge later described the union as not just immoral, but fundamentally coercive. But at the time, there were no warnings, no sirens, just another signature in a county file. It was Misty's uncle, Patricia's son, who exposed the truth. Stunned by the discovery, he contacted authorities. Within days, the marriage went from private scandal to national news. The headlines wrote themselves: "Mother marries daughter in Oklahoma. Incest case stuns local community." How did no one stop this? The public reaction was a mixture of horror and confusion. News outlets scrambled to confirm the details. Social media erupted with outrage. But behind the viral spectacle was a real, breathing victim, Misty, caught in a narrative she couldn't control. When investigators questioned Patricia, she didn't deny the relationship. Instead, she offered legal reasoning: that Misty was over 18, that her parental rights had been removed long ago, that no laws had technically been broken. But her arguments collapsed quickly under scrutiny. Oklahoma state law explicitly prohibits marriage between close relatives, biological or adopted. The marriage was invalid from the start. The legal system moved quickly. Arrest warrants were issued. Patricia was charged with felony incest. Misty was too, though her role would later be re-evaluated. In court, Misty told investigators she had been manipulated emotionally and psychologically, and had only agreed because she feared losing the fragile connection to her mother. The courthouse that had once united them now prepared to tear them apart. The state had failed once when it let Patricia back into Misty's life. But now it would have to answer another question: how do you prosecute a crime where the weapon wasn't a gun or a fist or a threat, but love perverted beyond recognition? The marriage to Misty was not the first. It wasn't even the first within the family. 8 years earlier, in 2008, Patricia and Spann had walked into another Oklahoma courthouse with another of her biological children, this time her son. His name has been withheld in many records, but the facts are clear: Patricia married her own son. The marriage was quickly annulled. It lasted only 2 years before legal authorities intervened. Yet no prison sentence followed, no deep investigation, just a quiet annulment, a deferred sentence, and the eerie silence that follows when something too grotesque to process is quietly shelved. The legal documents from that case describe the relationship in cautious language: unlawful, void, not recognized. But what they didn't say out loud is what now rings the loudest: this was a pattern, a method. A mother who didn't simply blur boundaries, but actively erased them. Not once. Twice. What drives someone to marry their own children? Psychologists studying these cases often point to a phenomenon known as genetic sexual attraction, or GSA, a rare and controversial condition in which close biological relatives, separated at birth or during childhood, reconnect later and experience misplaced romantic or sexual feelings due to unrecognized familial bonding. But GSA, if it applies at all, is only one part of the puzzle. In Patricia's case, the signs point not to mutual confusion, but to a predator's design. She was not estranged from her children by chance, she lost them because the state deemed her unfit. And when she reconnected with them, first her son, then her daughter, it was not under the banner of reconciliation, but control. She inserted herself back into their lives with charm, guilt, and the kind of emotional manipulation that doesn't leave bruises, but scars just the same. What's more disturbing is the system's repeated failure to stop her. After the 2008 marriage, Patricia should have been monitored, flagged, remembered. But records slipped, oversight faltered, and in that bureaucratic gap, she found room to act again. The truth is this: the Spann case isn't only about incest. It's about how abuse mutates when left unchecked. About how predators can wear the face of family. About how a mother, if left unchallenged, can become the architect of a quiet, generational horror, and do it twice without anyone stopping her. The courtroom was sterile, emotionless, lit with the kind of fluorescent clarity that leaves no shadows to hide in. It was there, under the gaze of judges and journalists, that Patricia Ann Spann stood accused, not just of incest, but of corruption so intimate it defied easy categorization. The state of Oklahoma charged her with felony incest, a crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Misty Velvet Dawn Spann was also charged, but her defense was clear: she had been coerced. Her consent, if it could even be called that, had been manufactured by years of psychological manipulation. Her lawyers painted a portrait of a woman who had never truly escaped her mother's orbit, a daughter who had been groomed not into romance, but into submission. Patricia, in court, remained largely unrepentant. She insisted there was no sexual relationship, that the marriage was symbolic, that the law didn't apply. But the facts said otherwise: the license, the shared home, the testimonies from family members, the echo of the previous marriage to her son. This wasn't symbolism. It was escalation. In 2017, Patricia Ann Spann was sentenced to 2 years in prison followed by 8 years of probation. Misty received a 10-year suspended sentence, no prison time, but strict conditions and mandatory counseling. The judge, in handing down the sentence, called the case an affront to the natural order of human relationships. But the question lingered: was justice truly served? 2 years was hardly enough to account for the depth of the damage, and prison could not undo what had already been shaped in Misty's mind, an identity forged in betrayal. She didn't just lose her mother, she lost her story, her self-concept, the timeline of who she might have been if the state had intervened more decisively years before. For Patricia, the consequences were legal. For Misty, they were existential. The public's attention moved on. The headlines faded. Another crime took its place in the cycle. But for those who followed the case closely, the aftermath revealed a deeper failure, not just of one woman's morality, but of a system that knew her history and still let her try again. Justice in the Spann case didn't look like resolution. It looked like a cold courtroom and a clock that had run too late. When the doors closed behind Patricia and Spann, the world exhaled. A woman who had married her own daughter, and before that her own son, was finally behind bars. The tabloids stopped printing. The hashtags faded. America, always eager to package its darkest truths into one-week scandals, quietly shelved the case. But some stories don't disappear. They echo. Misty Velvet Dawn Spann disappeared from the public eye shortly after the sentencing. She changed her name, left the state, tried perhaps to rebuild. But how does one rebuild after that kind of collapse? How do you mourn a mother who never existed in the form she should have? What becomes of a daughter raised not with tenderness, but with ownership? There were no public apologies from the state, no systemic reforms, no hearings to explain how Patricia was able to marry two of her own children without detection. The agencies involved offered silence, perhaps out of shame or fear, or the simple bureaucratic instinct to forget what cannot be explained. But the legacy of the Spann family is not a footnote. It's a reflection.